Hello everyone, this is John from RPGs and More, and in today's video I'd like to talk about a way that you can make your game worlds, your fantasy worlds for your role-playing games come alive in a way that might impress your players. Now what I'm going to talk about is pertinent to a sci-fi setting, a fantasy setting, a modern day setting. Any kind of setting can use this idea, this technique, or it's not really a specific technique, but it's a topic, I guess is a better term for it, a topic that we can talk about. And that is food. Now, it's quite common for our role-playing games to be Eurocentric or centered around European medieval styles. That's the most common style of setting in role-playing games outside of, say, Call of Cthulhu, in which case it's 1920s, England, or no, sorry, 1920s New England. So what does food have to do with a role-playing setting? Easy. What do your characters eat? Did you ever really stop and think about it aside from just going off the list that's in the player's handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide, depending on your system? Think about, does each nation that you have created for your setting or have a kind of a regional dish or something that they make that they're known for? Because if they don't, maybe they could. Why not? Think about our own world history, and I want you to consider, when you imagine a place like, say, France, Italy, when you imagine Ireland, when you imagine, say, Afghanistan, when you imagine China, when you imagine Japan, when you imagine Australia, do you imagine them all eating the same food? Almost certainly not. The food that we associate with different locations tends to be a product of the people and the culture that live in those locations. Now, sometimes it's also a product of geography. One of the reasons why rice has become so popular in many places is because it takes a very wet place for it to grow, and a lot of the places that it was developed as a staple tended to be have very predictable, very wet seasons, so it was easy to grow. Whereas something like wheat was a little more difficult because it was hard to find places to grow it. Same thing happens with other crops as well. One of the other things that have learned throughout history is what happens when new food is discovered. Right now, for us, it's very difficult to imagine a world without corn. At least, I should say, for us in the United States. Think about, next time you go to the grocery store, think about how many products have corn in it. How many products that we consume on a weekly basis have their basis in corn. Cornmeal, corn chips, for those of you who like the snacks, corn on the cob itself, corn tortillas, for people that love to eat tacos. I mean, almost every, unless you're making them at home, a lot of places that make tacos will give you a corn tortilla because they're easy and cheap to do. So, excuse me. The idea here is, until the American continent was discovered, those European nations had no idea what corn was. It was not part of their cuisine. Now, We have a hard time imagining a world without it. So there are adventure opportunities there in your fantasy world. For example, introducing a new food type. Your adventurers, your party could go on an adventure to a new city or to a new land. Find something that's different and exciting, something that we, the players, would recognize, but something that our characters wouldn't know about, and bring it home with us. And maybe, introduce it to the local population and create something new and something fun. You see in some television shows, people have fun with the idea of introducing mayonnaise to an earlier culture that has every capability of creating mayonnaise, but just has no idea what it is or how to do it. Excuse me. And that's part of how we can use food. Because in reality, a lot of recipes can be cooked on very basic tools, using very basic ingredients, as long as you know what those ingredients are and they're available to you. So think about what ingredients are in your fantasy world. You could have a more European-themed nation whose primary source of grain is rice. Why not? You don't have to limit things to where they came from culturally in our real world, if you don't want to. Just like you could switch that sort of thing around and have a certain area be known for their beef production. But when you do that, think about what that means, because that demands geography. It demands the option for how is this food going to be grown or taken care of in the case of animals. How are those animals then processed, or how is the food processed? So you're looking at technology levels. And then we're looking at transportation. Unless your nation that you've created is very agrarian, it's likely that it's going to be difficult for food to get from one place to another. And in most agrarian nations, the food didn't really, until more recent history, food did not tend to go too far from where it was originally planted by the time it was consumed, because we didn't have refrigeration, we didn't have a lot of means of storing things long term outside of the use of copious amounts of salt in order to brine or salt and preserve meats and fishes and other products as well. So that also affects things. Now, is there a ready supply of salt in your campaign setting? And where does that salt come from? These are questions that can greatly increase the verisimilitude of your setting when you start to analyze that sort of thing. Now, you don't have to go into deep detail about this. Most people aren't going to care, probably. And I'm not suggesting that you write an encyclopedia. But give it some thought, some concept. And for another example that would be kind of interesting is, let's say you have a nation that they're known for their cattle. They're known for just massive herds of cattle. Well, in this nation, probably leather is going to be cheap because it's easy to get your hands on it. There's going to be a lot of meat, beef specifically, available on the market. But a lot of the culture is also going to center around the creation, production, and maintenance of cattle in order to support that industry. So these are things that can have an outsized effect on how the culture works, because you're looking at a more, it doesn't have to be nomadic necessarily, but a population that will either follow the herd or will force the herd and guide the herd to market in the same way that we would see in, say, the Wild West of the United States with cowboys and cattle. This also would happen in other nations as well. The Mongols, if my history is correct, tended to have a lot with herding and cattle and various other animals in their culture. I mean, a lot of their culture focused around horses, but horses weren't the only things that they took care of in their culture. So think about what that all means and how that connects to things. Another example of how this can change a people is, if you're familiar with the Rohirrim from Lord of the Rings, or Rohan, as most people would know them, that is Professor Tolkien's take on the Scandinavian people, the Saxon people. That's to use the proper term from Tolkien's time, the Saxon people. Except he did one thing, and he replaced ships with horses. And that changed a lot about how they would perceive themselves while still keeping them as a recognizable thing. So if you want to have your nation be a little more believable, I want you to think about their food production. Think about how they get that food from one place to another. How is it available? And then what this can help you do is figure out what is available at that inn. Are they eating a lot of porridge? Probably. I mean, porridge was a very common food for a long time in the medieval ages because it was easy to make. The ingredients were very simple, and the ingredients were easy to store long term when you stored them dry. So porridge was popular. Not everyone dined on boar. Sorry. But another thing that you could think about is, why not introduce something like corn a couple of centuries earlier? And then you can have a medieval culture where, the corn tortilla is a regular thing, or corn bread. Why not? Have some fun with it. I'm not saying you need to keep yourself straitjacketed by the decisions that you make. Have absolute fun, but think about how it works and where it comes from, because you can create adventures. You can create that adventure of the party discovering corn and bringing it back, or discovering wheat and bringing it into a primarily corn-dominated society, and suddenly wheat bread becomes a thing, and now that's the new fad. You can really do a lot of different stuff with this. It can be a lot of fun. It can be a source of many adventures, introducing new things, discovering new things, or maybe seeking out solutions in order to stop bad things from happening. Let's say you've got a society that, I'll use the example of the potato famine in Ireland, where you had this huge famine where hundreds of thousands of people suffered and died. Because if I could have my math wrong, I'm sorry, I think I have it correct. But it's a very dangerous, very deadly thing. And what it was caused by was several factors. One of the key ones being the blight on the potato itself. Now, the potato was introduced to Ireland from, I believe it was North America. And it was very popular in Ireland because it was very easy to grow on very rocky soil that otherwise was unusable for most crops, most traditional, more European crops, because they just wouldn't grow on that kind of soil, whereas potatoes would, and would grow well. But then the blight happened, and that killed almost all of the potato crop, where very little of the crop was actually surviving long enough in order to actually feed someone. That was one factor. The other factor was that a lot of the grain and other things that were grown on Irish soil were being sold to other markets instead of being, sold to the Irish people. But a lot of that was because the Irish were so poor that they could not afford the food. And you can take a situation like this and put this into your game, where your adventurers travel to a new land that they've never been to before. Or maybe it is a land they have been to before, and they discovered that it's fallen on hard times. There's the harvest this past autumn failed. Food is becoming more scarce. Suddenly, that stay at the inn Well, staying at the inn is cheap. Getting a meal becomes more expensive. And then you start kind of hitting your adventurers in the wallet as a DM in order to show them that the world has changed, that prices aren't static. And that innkeeper will upcharge you for that ale because it costs the innkeeper more in order to get the ale or the bread into the inn. And so they're going to charge more because they still want to make a profit. Not only do they want to make a profit, but they know that they're going to have to pay an even higher price for food next time when they want to get more grain to make bread for the next guest. So that's connected. That can be connected, and that can create some interesting scenarios because now you're talking about a very human element. What do your magically endowed characters do when faced with a famine? I mean, yes, maybe you're playing a game where a magic user can summon up food at the call, at just a prayer or a few magical words and some gestures. How much food? And how often can they do it? How many people do you think they can feed? And once word gets out that they have the ability to create food, how many people are going to be willing to capture them in order to force them to make food? How many people are going to sit there and beg or be willing to pay them money, large sums of money, to create food just for the day? And what does that mean if you've got a cleric devoted to a god who is then in a position where they can make a lot of money just by using a divine blessing? And they choose to do so because, I mean, it's a good way to make money. They're helping the poor, quote unquote. They're making money. How does the god react to this? Is this the way that the gift was intended to be given? Could this be something that causes a rift between the character and the deity that they worship? Or is it something that the deity would approve of if it's a deity of unrestricted commerce and wealth above all, with no morals behind where that wealth comes from? But then we also come to another question of, if we're talking about a famine, something that is very reasonable and very practical in a lot of these early civilizations, we're also looking at how does that affect the structure of your place? Now, you could be talking about, say, rent prices going up because it's just more expensive. There's more, maybe the local government has raised taxes in order to try to raise money to feed the poor and the starving. Maybe they have other things. Maybe there's a war happening at the same time, and so the government's really raising taxes for the war, and it's making everything harder on everyone at the same time that this famine is already going on. Prices go up. People get kicked out of their homes. The homeless population in that nation can go up as a result of this, which can create more unrest, which can create more opportunities for adventure, both as you are adventuring to try to say, maybe you want to be on the side of the nobles who are really just trying to maintain law and order as they see it, and you are going to try to put down some of the rebellions that are taking place, or hunt the bandits that are now stalking the roads and taking down anyone who is seen as wealthy. And when you're starving, everyone's wealthier than you are. Maybe you're hunting bandits for that reason. Or maybe you decide to join the bandits, join the rebels, and take down these rich, fat cat landholders and spread the wealth back amongst the people, a very Robin Hood style, if that's your jam. That this scenario really supports that. It supports that kind of play, and it gives it a bit more oomph, because now it's not just money, it's food. And that can pull at people's heartstrings. Another thing that you can do is you can introduce the moral ambiguity of the situation. Say you've got a landlord, you've got two landlords that are neighbors. One of them, that in response to everything that's going on, they don't have a lot of charity. And they actually kick several of their renters off of their land, several of the people their tenants, I should say. They kicked them off the land. And they're viewed as the villain. Well, of course they are the villain. The people that they kicked off the land because these people couldn't afford to pay their rent and hadn't done so for months, those people are probably going to get sick, and if they can't find a new employment, they will die. So that landlord just became a villain. Let's look at another landlord, their neighbor. This landlord, the moment that this thing starts, they start doing charity everywhere. They go without at their own table in order to provide even just morsels for all the people that live on their land. They try to take care of their tenants. They go through and do as much as they can. They even take in some of the people who were kicked out of the other landlord's land. They take them in and try to take care of them. They're the good guy, right? Okay, advance the scenario by another year. The crop failed a second time. Things are more desperate than they were before. The landholder, who was frugal and ruthless, is still there. They have maybe had to let go of a few more tenants who could not pay, but those who could pay are still there. They're still working. They're still getting food. All the families there, the children that are there, they're still working. They're still getting food. The needs of that group are being met. And yes, there are people that are not making it. That is true, and that is a tragedy. But this landlord is not wavering in their stance. Now, the good guy landlord is destitute. They have given so much. They mortgaged their land in order to get more money to give more to the people so that their people wouldn't starve. They have given and given and given, and there's nothing left. And now because they don't have money, their loans come due, and they lose their land. And now they're homeless, and they're destitute, and they're starving, and so is everyone else, because the new person who owns the land just kicks everyone out. And no one has a place, and no one has food, and no one has a future. These are very real stories. These are things that happen in our history. And in some places, they may be happening even now. But let's add a fantasy element to that. Because it's our fantasy world, and so we don't like unhappy endings, right? So you come across that same scenario, or your players come across that same scenario. Well, what if there is a long-forgotten tomb somewhere on someone's land, maybe on the land of that noble, that kind noble? Or maybe it's on the land of the unkind noble. But the party goes in, and they investigate, and they find a big treasure. Well, they could keep it, and they could spend it, and get more magic items, and more power, and more capability. But what if they instead gave it to the kind noble, in order for that kind noble to not be poor and destitute, and be able to pay off their loans, and keep giving money, or keep buying food to take care of all of their tenants and the other tenants from the other place, and therefore supporting this person. And then that creates a conflict, because this money technically came from the land of the not kind noble, who is now very upset that their resource was taken from them, whether they knew about it or not. Maybe it was a newly discovered ancient tomb, or maybe it was their treasure store that was stolen in order to provide for this. But the players were involved in this situation, and then the players get to be involved again in some sort of attempt of resolution, because this turns into a conflict, and it could turn into an armed conflict very easily. Or it could turn into a political conflict and be settled in the courts of law of your nation, and that would be interesting too. And potentially more opportunity for tragedy or for heroics in the courtroom, or in the king's court, if you're going to go for politics and try to play politics with this whole situation. Those offer more options. The point is that there's a lot of things you can do with food. And if you think about food, if you think about what kinds of food you are serving in that inn, whether it is porridge or bread or meat, tortillas, rice, salad, where does the food come from? How does it get there? And then how can you connect production of food, movement of food, and maintenance of food into an adventure for your players to make it interesting, so that it doesn't always have to be about goblins and dragons. Maybe it is really about grain and silver and finding a new vegetable that can grow in a place that previously nothing would grow, or in taking care of people and meeting people and creating a community. These are just thoughts. I hope you enjoyed the video. I know it was a bit of a ramble, but I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something from it. I may revisit this topic in future because there's a lot that can be said about food production and how it would pertain to a medieval society or a Renaissance society or a sci-fi society, because even in the future, we still need farmers to grow our food. In future videos, I intend to address drinks as well, and I may get into a few other ideas about how we can address some of the more commonly overlooked areas of your campaign, because it's so much fun to really dig into it. Thank you again for stopping by. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and peace be with you. Bye-bye.